The Pacific Northwest, comprising Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, is home to about 15.2 million people as of 2025. Yet a staggering 73% of this entire population lives west of the Cascade Mountains, leaving enormous expanses of eastern territory virtually uninhabited. Eastern Oregon alone averages just one person per square mile, creating vast stretches where you can drive for hours without encountering a single town. These settlement patterns have remained remarkably stable over decades, resisting even major economic and technological shifts that might have redistributed population. What makes these eastern regions so persistently empty, and why does an ancient mountain range still determine where millions of Americans choose to live? The geographic divide that still shapes everything. The Cascade Range functions as North America's most effective population barrier, creating two distinct worlds separated by just a few hundred miles. This mountain chain stretches over 700 miles from Northern California through Washington, forming an ancient volcanic spine that rises abruptly from sea level to peaks exceeding 14,000 feet. Mount Rainier dominates the Washington landscape at 14,411 feet, while Oregon's Mount Hood reaches 11,249 feet, and dozens of other peaks create an almost impenetrable wall between east and west. The range didn't emerge overnight, but developed over millions of years through volcanic activity and tectonic forces that continue shaping the region today. West of the Cascades, moisture-laden Pacific air masses create the lush green environment most people associate with the Pacific Northwest. The Willamette Valley receives over 46 inches of annual precipitation, while Seattle averages 37 inches yearly. These western slopes capture incoming storms, supporting dense forests of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and cedar trees that tower over 200 feet tall. The landscape transforms into fertile valleys where major rivers like the Columbia and Willamette have deposited rich alluvial soils over thousands of years. Cross the mountain passes, and the environment changes dramatically within just 50 miles. Eastern Oregon receives less than 10 inches of annual precipitation in many areas, creating high desert conditions that stretch for hundreds of miles. Spokane, Washington, averages only 16 inches of yearly rainfall, while much of eastern Oregon and southern Idaho receive even less. The contrast becomes stark when you realize that the Willamette Valley receives nearly 5 times more precipitation than eastern Oregon's arid regions. This dramatic difference results from the rain-shadow effect, where mountains force air masses upward, cooling them and causing precipitation on the windward side while leaving the leeward side dry. The Cascades capture Pacific moisture so effectively that by the time air masses reach eastern areas, they've lost most of their water content. The result creates climate zones more different than those found between New York and Georgia, despite being separated by far shorter distances. Elevation changes compound these climate differences in ways that make eastern settlement challenging. While western valleys sit at comfortable elevations between sea level and 500 feet, much of eastern Oregon and Washington sits at elevations exceeding 2,000 feet, with many areas reaching 4,000 feet or higher. Higher elevations mean shorter growing seasons, more extreme temperature swings, and increased heating costs during winter months. The combination of altitude and aridity creates an environment that requires significant adaptation for comfortable human habitation. The Cascade Range restricts transportation corridors to just a handful of mountain passes, even with modern engineering capabilities. Interstate 84 follows the Columbia River Gorge, the only sea-level passage through the mountains, while Interstate 90 crosses Snoqualmie Pass at 3,022 feet elevation. Highway 58 traverses Willamette Pass at 5,128 feet, and several other routes require crossing elevations exceeding 4,000 feet. These limited corridors create transportation bottlenecks that increase shipping costs and travel times to eastern regions. Winter weather regularly closes these mountain passes, isolating eastern communities for days or weeks at a time. Snoqualmie Pass receives over 400 inches of annual snowfall, requiring constant maintenance and creating hazardous driving conditions from November through April. The Washington State Department of Transportation spends millions annually just maintaining these few mountain crossings, and despite these efforts, weather-related closures remain common throughout winter months. Volcanic activity within the Cascade Range continues influencing soil composition and agricultural potential across both regions. The 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption demonstrated how quickly volcanic events can reshape landscapes and affect local economies. Volcanic soils on western slopes create exceptional growing conditions for crops like hazelnuts, berries, and wine grapes, while eastern volcanic soils often lack sufficient organic matter and water retention capabilities needed for diverse agriculture. The United States Geological Survey maintains constant surveillance of potentially active volcanoes within the range, recognizing that future eruptions could significantly impact transportation corridors and settlement patterns. Volcanic hazard maps show that pyroclastic flows and lahars could affect populated areas on both sides of the mountains, but western valleys face greater risks due to their proximity to major volcanic centers. Modern data reveals the stark reality of this geographic divide. The 2025 American Community Survey confirms that 11.1 million of the Pacific Northwest's 15.2 million residents live within 100 miles of the Pacific coast, while areas more than 200 miles inland support fewer than 500,000 people across thousands of square miles. Satellite imagery captures this concentration in stunning detail, showing bright clusters of nighttime lights around Seattle, Portland, and other western cities, while vast dark areas extend across eastern regions. Transportation modeling studies conducted in 2024 show that the geographic barriers created by the Cascade Range continue limiting development options for eastern regions. Even with improved highway systems and communication technology, the fundamental challenges of crossing mountain barriers while maintaining economic connections to major population centers remain unchanged. The ancient geological forces that created these mountains continue dictating settlement patterns, but the geographic divide tells only part of the story. Beyond mountains and climate, another fundamental resource shapes where people can actually build sustainable communities. Why water still determines where cities grow. Water access remains the single most important factor determining where cities can grow and sustain large populations. The answer becomes clear when examining how western rivers like the Columbia and Willamette continue supporting metropolitan areas with millions of residents, while eastern regions struggle with fundamental water limitations. The Columbia River alone carries an average flow of 265,000 cubic feet per second past Portland, providing abundant freshwater for municipal use, industrial operations, and agricultural irrigation throughout the western valleys. This massive river system originates in the Canadian Rockies and collects water from over 258,000 square miles of drainage area, creating a dependable water source that has supported human settlement for thousands of years. The Willamette River adds another 37,400 cubic feet per second of flow, draining the fertile western valleys that now support over 2.3 million residents in the Portland metropolitan area. These rivers created the alluvial soils that make western agriculture productive without extensive irrigation, while simultaneously providing the water resources necessary for urban growth. Seattle draws water from the Cedar River and Tolt River watersheds in the Cascade Mountains, systems that provide over 150 million gallons daily to support 1.4 million residents in the greater Seattle area. The consistent precipitation feeding these western watersheds ensures reliable water supplies even during dry years. Eastern regions face dramatically different water realities despite technological advances that theoretically make desert living more feasible. The Snake River provides the largest water source for eastern areas, but its flow varies significantly with seasonal snowmelt and precipitation patterns. Boise receives water from the Boise River system, which carries substantially less volume than western rivers and requires careful management to meet municipal needs for just 750,000 metropolitan residents. The Spokane River supports about 550,000 people in the Spokane metropolitan area, representing the practical upper limit for urban growth given available water resources in that watershed. Complex irrigation systems across eastern Washington, Oregon, and Idaho demonstrate both the possibilities and limitations of modern water management in arid regions. The Columbia Basin Project irrigates over 670,000 acres in central Washington through an elaborate network of canals, pumping stations, and reservoirs that cost billions to construct and maintain. This system requires massive amounts of energy to lift water from the Columbia River up to elevations exceeding 1,000 feet, making agricultural production economically viable, but highlighting the enormous costs of supporting large populations in water-scarce areas. The Grand Coulee Dam pumps water into Banks Lake, which then feeds the irrigation network through concrete-lined canals stretching over 300 miles across the Columbia Plateau. Operating this system consumes enough electricity annually to power a city of 200,000 residents, illustrating why extending similar infrastructure to support urban populations becomes prohibitively expensive. Eastern Oregon relies on the Umatilla River, John Day River, and numerous smaller streams that provide insufficient water for major metropolitan development without massive and costly infrastructure investments. Climate change has fundamentally altered water availability patterns across both regions since 2020, creating new challenges for eastern areas while maintaining western advantages. The Pacific Northwest has experienced hotter and drier conditions, leading to declining snowpack levels that affect river flows throughout the region. Cascade Mountains snowpack, which provides natural water storage for western rivers, decreased by an average of 23% between 2020 and 2025 compared to historical averages. Eastern areas dependent on Rocky Mountain snowpack have experienced even more severe reductions, with some watersheds showing 35% declines in annual snowmelt contributions. Reservoir levels across central and eastern Oregon and southern Idaho reached critically low levels during the 2021 and 2023 drought years, forcing agricultural water restrictions and highlighting the vulnerability of eastern water supplies. Lake Billy Chinook in central Oregon dropped to just 32% of capacity in 2021, while the Owyhee Reservoir in southeastern Oregon fell to 18% of normal levels. Western reservoirs also experienced low levels, but their larger capacity and more reliable inflow patterns allowed continued municipal water supplies without severe restrictions. The costs and limitations of transporting water to support large populations in arid eastern areas remain economically prohibitive despite modern engineering capabilities. Calculating the infrastructure needed to pipe water from the Columbia River to support a hypothetical eastern city of 500,000 residents reveals costs exceeding $15 billion for initial construction alone. Annual operating costs would include massive energy requirements for pumping water across hundreds of miles and thousands of feet of elevation gain. Water rights and availability continue functioning as the ultimate limiting factor for eastern expansion, regardless of other economic opportunities or technological advances. Western states follow the doctrine of prior appropriation for water rights, meaning older claims take priority during shortages. Most available water rights in eastern river systems were claimed decades ago for agricultural use, leaving little water legally available for new municipal development. Acquiring sufficient water rights for a new city of even 100,000 residents would require purchasing rights from existing agricultural users at costs that make development economically unviable. The fundamental reality remains that water determines where cities can grow, and eastern regions simply lack the abundant, reliable water sources that continue supporting millions of residents west of the Cascades. Yet even as these geographic and resource constraints persist, modern economic forces have emerged that might have been expected to reshape settlement patterns entirely. The tech boom that made everything worse. The technology industry's explosive growth has actually intensified these population disparities in ways few predicted. Amazon employs over 75,000 people in the Seattle metropolitan area alone, while Microsoft maintains its Redmond headquarters with approximately 60,000 local employees. Google has expanded its Seattle operations to include more than 8,000 workers, and Meta employs another 4,500 people in the same region. These numbers represent just the direct employees of major tech companies, not counting the thousands of contractors, suppliers, and service providers that support these operations. Portland has experienced similar tech concentration, with Nike's global headquarters employing 12,000 people locally, while Intel maintains over 23,000 employees across its Washington County campuses. The combined payroll of these companies exceeds $15 billion annually in the Portland metropolitan area alone, creating enormous economic gravitational pull that attracts additional workers and businesses. This concentration has created what economists call agglomeration effects, where the presence of one major company makes a location more attractive for others in the same industry. Tech companies avoid establishing major operations in eastern regions for reasons that go beyond simple preference. The infrastructure requirements for modern technology companies include fiber optic networks capable of handling massive data transfers, electrical grids with 99.9% uptime reliability, and proximity to major airports for frequent business travel. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport handles over 50 million passengers annually and provides direct flights to major Asian markets that are crucial for tech companies with global operations. Eastern regions lack comparable infrastructure, with Spokane International Airport handling fewer than 4 million passengers yearly and offering limited international connections. The skilled labor requirements for technology companies create another barrier to eastern expansion. The University of Washington graduates over 1,500 computer science students annually, while Washington State University produces another 400 graduates yearly. Oregon State University and Portland State University combined graduate nearly 800 computer science students each year. These universities have developed specialized programs and research partnerships with local tech companies, creating a steady pipeline of qualified workers. Eastern regions lack universities with comparable computer science programs or the critical mass of graduates needed to support major tech operations. High-paying tech jobs have fundamentally altered housing markets throughout Western metropolitan areas, creating a feedback loop that attracts even more highly educated workers. The median salary for software engineers in Seattle reached $165,000 in 2025, compared to $95,000 for similar positions in Spokane. Amazon's stock compensation packages often add another $50,000 to $100,000 annually to employee compensation, creating wealth that drives up real estate prices throughout the Puget Sound region. Housing prices in King County increased by 85% between 2015 and 2025, yet tech workers continued moving to the area because salary premiums more than offset higher living costs. Network effects make tech companies cluster together rather than spreading across geographic regions, intensifying Western concentration patterns. When Apple established its engineering offices in Seattle, the company specifically cited access to talent from other tech companies as a primary factor. Facebook's Seattle expansion targeted engineers from Amazon and Microsoft, while Google's growth strategy involved recruiting from the existing tech ecosystem. This creates a circular pattern where each new tech company makes a location more attractive for additional tech companies, while making it harder for isolated eastern locations to compete for the same talent and investment. Remote work trends following 2020 were initially expected to redistribute tech workers across broader geographic areas, potentially benefiting eastern regions with lower living costs. Survey data from major tech companies showed that 40% of employees expressed interest in relocating to less expensive areas if remote work became permanent. However, actual migration patterns tell a different story. Analysis of address changes among tech workers between 2020 and 2025 shows that 78% remained within 50 miles of their original locations, while only 12% moved to areas more than 200 miles from major tech centers. Tech workers who did relocate during the remote work period often returned to Western metropolitan areas within 2 to 3 years. Exit interviews and surveys conducted by major tech companies reveal that relocated workers missed career networking opportunities, professional development programs, and collaborative work environments available in established tech centers. Many companies began requiring hybrid work arrangements by 2023, effectively ending the fully remote work experiment and encouraging employees to return to major metropolitan areas. The digital divide between Western and Eastern regions has widened rather than narrowed despite increased attention to broadband infrastructure. Western metropolitan areas now have access to gigabit internet service with multiple provider options, while many Eastern communities still rely on DSL connections with speeds below 25 megabits per second. The Federal Communications Commission's 2025 broadband availability maps show that 94% of Western urban areas have access to high-speed internet, compared to just 67% of Eastern rural areas. Venture capital investment patterns reinforce these technological and geographic disparities. Pacific Northwest startups received $8.2 billion in venture capital funding during 2024, with 89% of investments going to companies located within 30 miles of Seattle or Portland. Eastern regions received less than $200 million in venture capital during the same period, despite having 27% of the region's total land area. The technology boom has essentially created a winner-take-all economy within the Pacific Northwest, where Western metropolitan areas capture the vast majority of high-value economic activity, while Eastern regions become increasingly isolated from the digital economy. Yet beyond these economic forces, environmental changes since 2020 have introduced entirely new factors that further complicate settlement patterns across the region. Climate change creates new barriers. Wildfire risks have transformed Eastern regions into genuine deterrents for new residential and commercial development. The 2020 wildfire season burned over 1.2 million acres across eastern Oregon and Washington, while the 2021 season consumed another 800,000 acres in the same regions. The bootleg fire in eastern Oregon alone burned 413,000 acres, making it the largest fire in the United States that year. These massive fires destroyed hundreds of homes and businesses, but more importantly demonstrated to potential residents and investors that eastern areas face ongoing risks that western regions largely avoid. Insurance companies have responded to increased wildfire activity by dramatically raising premiums or refusing to write policies in high-risk eastern areas. Homeowners' insurance rates in eastern Oregon counties increased by an average of 47% between 2020 and 2025, while similar properties in western valleys saw increases of only 12% during the same period. Some insurance companies have stopped writing new policies entirely in counties like Grant, Harney, and Lake in eastern Oregon, effectively making new construction economically unfeasible in these areas. The Pacific Northwest heat wave during summer 2021 brought unprecedented temperatures that killed over 600 people across the region, with eastern areas experiencing the most severe conditions. Pendleton, Oregon recorded temperatures of 119 degrees, while Spokane reached 109 degrees during the same heat event. These extreme temperatures exposed the vulnerability of eastern communities that lacked the infrastructure and cooling systems needed to protect residents during dangerous heat waves. Air conditioning usage patterns reveal how climate change has increased living costs in eastern regions, while western areas maintain more comfortable conditions. Eastern Washington households now spend an average of $340 more annually on cooling costs compared to 2015 levels, while Western Washington households increased cooling expenses by only $85 during the same period. The combination of higher temperatures and increased energy costs makes eastern living more expensive and less comfortable than in previous decades. Changing precipitation patterns have fundamentally affected agricultural viability across different zones, with eastern regions experiencing more severe impacts than western areas. Central Oregon received 23% less precipitation between 2020 and 2025 compared to historical averages, forcing farmers to rely more heavily on irrigation systems that strain limited water resources. The Deschutes River Basin, which supports agriculture across Central Oregon, reached critically low levels during 2021 and 2023, requiring emergency water restrictions that affected both agricultural operations and municipal water supplies. Crop yields across eastern Oregon and Washington have declined due to increased drought conditions and extreme heat events. Wheat production in eastern Washington decreased by 18% between 2020 and 2025, while barley yields in eastern Oregon fell by 22% during the same period. These declining agricultural returns have reduced employment opportunities in rural areas and made farming operations less profitable, contributing to continued population decline in eastern counties. Heat waves and drought conditions have measurably worsened quality of life in eastern communities, creating health risks and economic hardships that discourage population growth. Emergency room visits for heat-related illnesses in eastern Oregon increased by 67% during summer months between 2020 and 2025, while western Oregon saw increases of only 23% during the same period. Rural hospitals in eastern regions lack the resources to handle surges in heat-related medical emergencies, creating additional risks for residents during extreme weather events. Water restrictions have become routine in eastern communities, affecting everything from lawn care to business operations. The City of Bend implemented mandatory water restrictions during 4 of the 5 years between 2020 and 2025, while Medford required restrictions during 3 of those years. These limitations make eastern areas less attractive to businesses and residents who expect reliable water access for daily activities. Climate refugees from other regions have predominantly settled in western cities rather than eastern areas, despite lower housing costs in eastern locations. California residents fleeing wildfire-prone areas have moved to Portland and Seattle in significant numbers, with over 23,000 California migrants settling in King County alone between 2020 and 2025. These climate migrants typically seek areas with better infrastructure, healthcare systems, and emergency services, advantages that western metropolitan areas provide more effectively than eastern communities. Infrastructure damage from extreme weather has created enormous costs for rebuilding in vulnerable eastern areas. The 2020 wildfires caused over $400 million in infrastructure damage across eastern Oregon, including destroyed power lines, communication towers, and transportation systems. Rebuilding costs in remote eastern locations often exceed similar repairs in western areas due to longer distances for equipment and materials transport. Climate projections are now directly influencing long-term development planning and investment decisions across the region in ways that disadvantage eastern areas. The latest climate models predict that eastern Oregon and Washington will experience temperature increases of 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050, along with 15% to 25% decreases in summer precipitation. These projections have led major developers to focus investment on western metropolitan areas, where climate impacts are expected to be less severe. The cumulative effect of these climate-related changes has been to make eastern regions less attractive for population growth, while reinforcing the advantages of Western metropolitan areas. Yet beyond these environmental barriers, fundamental economic calculations continue determining where development actually occurs. The economics of empty land. Infrastructure costs reveal why millions of acres across eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and Idaho remain economically unviable despite seemingly attractive land prices. When developers evaluate potential projects in remote eastern locations, they encounter infrastructure requirements that multiply total project costs by factors of 3 to 5 compared to similar developments in western metropolitan areas. These calculations consistently favor continued investment in already developed western regions rather than expansion into eastern territories. Extending basic utilities to remote eastern locations creates immediate financial barriers that make most development projects economically impossible. Bringing electrical service to a hypothetical new community of 10,000 residents in Central Oregon would require installing over 50 miles of new transmission lines at costs exceeding $2.8 million per mile. Pacific Power estimates that extending three-phase electrical service to remote locations costs between $125,000 and $200,000 per mile, depending on terrain and environmental requirements. Natural gas pipeline extensions face similar cost challenges, with interstate pipeline companies requiring minimum usage commitments that remote communities cannot guarantee. Internet infrastructure presents even more complex economic challenges for eastern development. Fiber optic cable installation across eastern Oregon costs approximately $27,000 per mile in flat terrain and up to $65,000 per mile in mountainous areas. A new eastern community would need multiple fiber connections for redundancy, potentially requiring 200 or more miles of new cable installation. The total cost of providing reliable internet service to a remote eastern community often exceeds $8 million before serving a single customer. Water and sewer infrastructure costs compound these utility expenses in ways that make eastern development prohibitively expensive. Drilling wells capable of supporting municipal water systems in eastern Oregon typically costs between $175,000 and $350,000 per well, with no guarantee of adequate water quality or quantity. Municipal wastewater treatment plants sized for 10,000 residents cost approximately $15 million to construct, plus annual operating expenses exceeding $1.2 million. Western communities benefit from existing regional utility systems that reduce per-unit infrastructure costs through economies of scale. Transportation infrastructure requirements add another layer of expense that investors must consider when evaluating eastern development opportunities. Building a two-lane highway connecting a remote eastern community to existing interstate systems costs between $3.2 and $5.8 million per mile, depending on terrain and environmental requirements. The Oregon Department of Transportation estimates that maintaining rural highways costs $45,000 per mile annually, expenses that must be supported by local tax bases. Airport construction capable of supporting business aviation requires initial investments of $25 to $40 million, costs that cannot be justified without substantial population and economic activity. Economies of scale create powerful economic forces that favor continued concentration rather than geographic distribution across eastern regions. Western metropolitan areas benefit from shared infrastructure costs spread across millions of residents, making additional development less expensive per capita. Seattle's municipal water system serves 1.4 million customers, allowing infrastructure costs to be distributed efficiently. Eastern communities might support only a few thousand residents, making comparable infrastructure investments economically unfeasible on a per capita basis. Job market limitations prevent eastern regions from supporting the large populations needed to justify major infrastructure investments. The eastern Oregon economy primarily depends on agriculture, forestry, and government employment, sectors that provide relatively few high-paying jobs compared to Western metropolitan areas. Gilliam County, Oregon has an economy almost entirely dependent on wind energy and wheat farming, supporting fewer than 2,000 residents across 1,223 square miles. Creating sufficient employment to support populations of 50,000 or more would require entirely new economic foundations that do not currently exist. Global economic trends increasingly favor coastal and connected metropolitan areas over inland regions, making eastern development less attractive to investors seeking maximum returns. International trade flows through ports in Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, creating economic activity and employment opportunities that cannot be replicated in inland locations. Financial services, technology companies, and advanced manufacturing operations cluster near major airports and shipping facilities, advantages that eastern regions cannot match despite lower land costs. Venture capital and investment patterns demonstrate how modern finance reinforces Western concentration rather than supporting Eastern expansion. Pacific Northwest venture capital investments totaled $8.7 billion in 2024, with 91% of funding going to companies located within 40 miles of Seattle or Portland. Eastern regions received less than $180 million in venture capital during the same period, despite containing most of the region's land area. Several failed development projects in eastern regions illustrate the financial risks that continue deterring investment in remote locations. The Rajneeshpuram community in central Oregon attracted over 2,000 residents during the 1980s, but ultimately failed due to infrastructure costs and legal challenges that exceeded $100 million. More recently, the proposed Cascade Springs development in eastern Oregon was cancelled after infrastructure cost estimates reached $340 million for a planned community of 12,000 residents. The fundamental economics of infrastructure, employment, and modern commerce continue making vast eastern territories economically unviable for large-scale development despite abundant land availability and relatively low acquisition costs. These economic forces prove more powerful than government incentives or technological advances in determining where Americans choose to build communities and invest capital. Yet even in regions where economic activity does exist, the relationship between land use and population density often defies common expectations. Agriculture's surprising population limits. Modern agricultural practices reveal why productive farmland actually supports fewer people than most assume. A single farmer operating GPS-guided equipment can now manage over 2,000 acres of wheat production, compared to the 160-acre family farms that once supported entire rural communities. Combine harvesters costing over $750,000 process hundreds of acres daily with just one operator, eliminating the seasonal employment that once brought temporary workers to rural areas during harvest seasons. This technological transformation has fundamentally altered the relationship between agricultural productivity and population density across eastern regions. Agricultural automation has systematically reduced rural employment opportunities in ways that make these regions less capable of supporting large populations. Dairy operations that once employed 15 to 20 workers per 500 cows now operate with automated milking systems, requiring only 3 to 4 employees for the same herd size. Idaho's potato processing facilities use computerized sorting and packaging systems that eliminated thousands of seasonal jobs across the state's agricultural regions. These technological advances increase productivity and profits for farm operators while simultaneously reducing the employment base needed to support rural communities. Corporate farming operations have replaced family farms that historically supported rural communities through local spending and employment. Agribusiness corporations now control over 60% of wheat production across eastern Washington, operating massive farms that employ fewer people per acre than the family operations they replaced. These corporate farms purchase supplies and equipment from regional distributors rather than local merchants, reducing the economic multiplier effects that once sustained rural businesses. Corporate headquarters located in distant cities capture profits that previously circulated within rural communities, further reducing the economic foundation needed to support local populations. The Cargill Corporation operates grain elevators and processing facilities throughout eastern Oregon and Washington, but these facilities employ far fewer workers than the dozens of family-owned elevators they replaced. Corporate efficiency means fewer jobs, less local ownership, and reduced economic activity in the small towns that depend on agricultural processing. Similar patterns appear throughout Idaho's potato industry, where corporate processors have consolidated operations into fewer, more automated facilities that require minimal local employment. Global commodity markets affect agricultural viability in ways that favor consolidated operations over distributed rural communities. Eastern Washington wheat farmers compete directly with Ukrainian producers who benefit from lower labor costs and different regulatory environments. This competition pressures local farmers to reduce costs through automation and consolidation rather than maintaining employment levels that could support vibrant rural communities. Barley prices fell 23% between 2020 and 2025, forcing many eastern Oregon farmers to reduce operations or sell to larger corporate entities. Transportation costs create additional advantages for certain agricultural zones, while disadvantaging others in ways that affect population distribution. Eastern Washington wheat farmers located near Columbia River shipping facilities maintain cost advantages over producers in remote eastern Oregon locations who face higher transportation expenses to reach export markets. Rail transportation from eastern Oregon to Portland costs approximately $45 per ton more than similar shipments from eastern Washington, reducing profitability for farmers in less accessible locations. Climate change has shifted optimal growing regions and affected local economies in ways that further reduce agricultural employment potential. Rising temperatures have made some traditional wheat-growing areas in eastern Oregon less suitable for grain production, forcing farmers to switch to crops requiring less labor. Increased drought conditions have reduced hay production across eastern regions, eliminating seasonal employment that once supported rural workers. Idaho's agricultural sector faces particular vulnerability as climate projections show central and western Idaho experiencing more extreme heat than eastern regions under current emissions scenarios. Rural population decline continues even in successful agricultural areas, demonstrating how efficient agriculture produces fewer jobs rather than more. Gilliam County, Oregon produces millions of dollars worth of wheat annually, but has lost 15% of its population since 2010. The county's agricultural success comes from highly mechanized operations that require minimal labor, leaving fewer employment opportunities to support local residents. Similar patterns appear throughout eastern Washington, where successful wheat production coincides with declining rural populations. Wasco County, Oregon exports over $200 million worth of agricultural products annually, but supports only 26,000 residents across 2,381 square miles. The county's agricultural productivity continues increasing through technological improvements and consolidation, but these advances require fewer workers and support smaller populations. Modern agriculture's efficiency creates a paradox where productive farmland supports fewer people rather than more. The fundamental relationship between agriculture and population has inverted from historical patterns where farming communities supported dense rural populations. Modern agricultural efficiency means that the most productive farming regions often have the lowest population densities because successful agriculture no longer requires large numbers of workers. This reality explains why vast agricultural areas across eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and Idaho remain sparsely populated despite their economic productivity. Efficient agriculture has become a barrier to population growth rather than a driver of rural community development, but the isolation of these regions extends beyond employment patterns. The infrastructure systems that connect communities to broader economic networks follow their own logic of concentration and efficiency. Transportation networks that reinforce isolation. Highway systems reveal how transportation infrastructure systematically isolates eastern regions from economic opportunities. Interstate 5 runs directly through Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, carrying over 240,000 vehicles daily through urban corridors, while eastern regions rely on two-lane highways with minimal traffic. Interstate 84 serves eastern Oregon, but connects primarily to western population centers rather than creating independent eastern economic zones. The result creates a transportation hierarchy where western cities benefit from high-capacity infrastructure, while eastern areas remain dependent on inadequate rural highways. Major airports demonstrate this concentration pattern most clearly, with Seattle-Tacoma International Airport handling over 50 million passengers annually, while eastern airports serve tiny fractions of that volume. Spokane International Airport processes fewer than 4 million passengers yearly despite serving eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and parts of eastern Oregon. Portland International Airport moves 20 million passengers annually, creating economic activity and business connections that eastern regions cannot match. Regional airports in places like Pendleton, La Grande, and Ontario, Oregon offer limited commercial service, with flights primarily connecting to western cities rather than creating independent transportation networks. Rail infrastructure follows similar patterns, with freight and passenger services concentrating along western corridors that connect major population centers. BNSF Railway operates its primary Pacific Northwest routes through the Columbia River Gorge and Puget Sound region, moving over 100 million tons of freight annually through western corridors. Union Pacific maintains rail lines through eastern Oregon, but uses these primarily for through traffic rather than local economic development. Amtrak passenger service exists only between Seattle, Portland, and intermediate western cities, leaving eastern regions entirely without passenger rail connections. The cost of building transportation links to remote eastern areas remains economically prohibitive despite potential benefits for regional development. Constructing a new interstate highway to connect central Oregon with major markets would cost between $8 and $12 million per mile, depending on terrain and environmental requirements. The Oregon Department of Transportation estimates that building a 4-lane highway from Bend to the Willamette Valley would require over $2.4 billion in initial construction costs, plus ongoing maintenance expenses exceeding $15 million annually. These figures make such projects impossible to justify based on current population and economic activity in eastern regions. Airport construction presents even greater financial challenges for eastern development. Building a regional airport capable of handling commercial jet service requires initial investments between $150 and $300 million, depending on runway length and terminal facilities. Eastern Oregon's largest communities could not generate sufficient passenger volume to support airline service that would justify such investments. The economics become circular, where airports require population to justify construction, but populations cannot grow without airport access to support business development. Existing transportation networks create powerful feedback loops that reinforce current population patterns rather than encouraging geographic distribution. Freight companies locate distribution centers near major highways and airports, concentrating employment opportunities in western metropolitan areas. Amazon operates massive fulfillment centers near Seattle and Portland, but has no comparable facilities in eastern regions, despite lower land costs and available space. FedEx and UPS maintain their regional hubs in western cities, creating logistics networks that favor businesses located near existing population centers. Geographic barriers continue limiting transportation options despite modern engineering capabilities. The Cascade Range restricts east-west highway connections to just 5 major passes, with winter weather regularly closing several routes for days or weeks at a time. The Columbia River creates a natural transportation corridor, but primarily benefits existing western population centers rather than opening eastern regions for development. Building new mountain passes would require enormous engineering projects, costing billions of dollars for limited traffic volumes. Freight and shipping costs create substantial disadvantages for businesses attempting to operate in remote eastern locations. Trucking companies charge premium rates for deliveries to eastern Oregon and Idaho destinations because of longer distances, lower delivery densities, and return trip challenges. Shipping a standard container from Portland to Pendleton costs $340 more than similar deliveries within the Portland metropolitan area. These transportation cost differences accumulate across all business operations, making eastern commercial development less competitive regardless of lower land and labor costs. Public transportation systems prove economically unviable in low-density eastern areas where potential ridership cannot support operating costs. Bus systems require minimum population densities of 2,000 people per square mile to generate sufficient ridership for basic service, densities that exist only in western metropolitan areas. Eastern Oregon counties average fewer than 15 people per square mile, making public transit mathematically impossible regardless of government subsidies. Modern logistics and supply chain efficiency actually favor concentration over geographic distribution in ways that make eastern locations less viable for business operations. Just-in-time delivery systems require proximity to major distribution networks located in western metropolitan areas. Manufacturing operations depend on quick access to suppliers and customers, advantages that eastern regions cannot provide despite lower operational costs. E-commerce fulfillment requires next-day delivery capabilities that are only economically feasible from western distribution centers serving large population concentrations. Transportation networks have become self-reinforcing systems that concentrate economic opportunity in western regions while systematically isolating eastern areas from modern commerce. Yet even as these infrastructure barriers seemed insurmountable, the emergence of remote work technology promised to fundamentally change how location affects economic opportunity. The remote work revolution that wasn't. Initial expectations for remote work seemed logical and well-founded when the pandemic began. Technology workers earning Seattle salaries could theoretically move to eastern Oregon towns where housing costs 60% less while maintaining their income levels. Rural communities anticipated an influx of educated professionals who would revitalize local economies and support new businesses. Government officials expected remote work to solve long-standing problems of urban overcrowding and rural economic decline. The reality proved dramatically different from these optimistic projections. Remote work adoption reached unprecedented levels during 2020 and 2021, with major Pacific Northwest employers like Amazon, Microsoft, and Nike allowing employees to work from anywhere indefinitely. Survey data from September 2022 showed that 15% of employees worked from home full-time, representing a massive increase from pre-pandemic levels of less than 3%. Early migration patterns suggested significant population redistribution might occur, with expensive urban areas losing residents, while smaller communities gained new arrivals. Manhattan and San Francisco experienced population declines of nearly 10% among working-age adults between 2020 and 2021, indicating that remote work enabled substantial geographic mobility for knowledge workers. However, the gap between remote work possibilities and actual migration patterns revealed fundamental limitations that planners had not anticipated. College-educated Americans and workers in information, finance, and professional services demonstrated the highest remote work adoption rates, exactly the demographic groups that Eastern communities hope to attract. These same workers faced practical barriers that kept them concentrated in Western metropolitan areas despite potential cost savings from Eastern relocation. Internet infrastructure limitations continue constraining remote work viability across many Eastern areas, creating technical barriers that prevent professionals from relocating. Broadband availability maps from 2025 show that 94% of Western urban areas have access to high-speed internet capable of supporting video conferencing and large file transfers, compared to just 67% of Eastern rural areas. Many Eastern Oregon communities still rely on DSL connections providing speeds below 25 megabits per second, insufficient for professional remote work, requiring constant video calls and cloud-based applications. Satellite internet services like Starlink have improved rural connectivity, but still cannot match the reliability and speed that urban fiber networks provide. Social and cultural factors kept remote workers concentrated in Western metropolitan areas despite financial incentives to relocate eastward. Professional networking opportunities, industry conferences, and career development programs remain concentrated in Seattle and Portland, making Eastern relocation potentially damaging to long-term career prospects. Young professionals particularly value access to diverse social scenes, cultural amenities, and dating opportunities that Eastern communities cannot match regardless of housing cost advantages. Companies began implementing return-to-office policies by 2023 that reversed early remote work migration trends and encouraged employees to return to Western metropolitan areas. Amazon announced hybrid work requirements mandating 3 days per week in corporate offices, effectively ending fully remote arrangements for most employees. Microsoft implemented similar policies requiring regular in-person collaboration, while Google reduced remote work options to just 2 days per week. These policy changes forced remote workers who had relocated to Eastern areas to choose between new jobs or returning to Western cities near corporate headquarters. The trend toward hybrid work models rather than fully remote arrangements fundamentally changed migration calculations for potential Eastern relocators. While 34% of workers were fully remote in 2022, this percentage decreased to just 7% by 2023 as companies required partial office attendance. Hybrid work increased from 25% in 2022 to 26% in 2023, but hybrid arrangements require proximity to corporate offices located in Western metropolitan areas. Workers living in Eastern Oregon or Idaho cannot participate in hybrid work arrangements that require regular Seattle or Portland office visits, limiting relocation options for most knowledge workers. Access to healthcare, educational opportunities, and professional services continued mattering significantly for remote workers despite their theoretical freedom from geographic constraints. Eastern Oregon communities often lack specialists, advanced medical facilities, and educational resources that families with children require. Remote workers with families discovered that housing cost savings disappeared when factoring in travel expenses for medical appointments, private schooling costs, and limited childcare options in rural areas. Remote workers who initially moved to Eastern areas during the pandemic often returned to Western cities within 2 to 3 years of relocating. Exit interviews conducted by major Pacific Northwest employers revealed that relocated workers missed professional development opportunities, collaborative work environments, and social connections available in established metropolitan areas. Many discovered that career advancement required in-person networking and visibility that remote work could not provide, regardless of job performance. Population movement data during and after the remote work surge demonstrates that actual migration patterns differed dramatically from initial predictions. King County gained 47,000 new residents between 2020 and 2025, with the majority working in technology and professional services. Washington County, Oregon added 23,000 residents during the same period, contradicting expectations that remote work would reduce Western metropolitan growth. Eastern counties continued losing population despite remote work opportunities, with several counties experiencing net outmigration exceeding 5% of total population during the supposed remote work boom. Remote work ultimately reinforced existing settlement patterns rather than challenging the geographic concentration of Pacific Northwest population. The 2025 census data shows that 73% of regional residents still live west of the Cascade Mountains, representing virtually no change from pre-pandemic distribution patterns. Remote work proved insufficient to overcome the fundamental geographic, economic, and social advantages that Western metropolitan areas maintain over Eastern regions. Yet beyond these market forces and technological limitations, another set of powerful influences has shaped these settlement patterns in unexpected ways. Government policies that accidentally concentrate population. Federal policies intended to promote rural development have systematically channeled resources toward Western metropolitan areas while leaving Eastern regions increasingly isolated. These unintended consequences result from policy structures that favor areas with existing infrastructure, population density, and political representation. King County received over $8.2 billion in federal contracts and grants during 2024, while entire Eastern Oregon received less than $400 million during the same period. This disparity reflects procurement systems that award contracts to companies located near federal facilities and universities, which concentrate in Western metropolitan areas. The Small Business Administration distributed $1.4 billion in loans across the Pacific Northwest during 2024, but 78% of these funds went to businesses located within 50 miles of Seattle or Portland. Eastern regions received proportionally smaller amounts despite having greater need for economic development assistance. This pattern occurs because loan programs favor businesses with established credit histories, existing banking relationships, and proximity to SBA offices, advantages that Western metropolitan businesses possess over Eastern rural enterprises. Federal highway funding formulas demonstrate how transportation policies inadvertently concentrate development in Western regions while neglecting Eastern infrastructure needs. The Federal Highway Administration allocates funds based on traffic volume, population density, and existing highway mileage, criteria that favor Western metropolitan areas with established transportation networks. Interstate 5 through Seattle and Portland receives over $200 million annually in federal maintenance and improvement funding, while Highway 395 through Eastern Washington receives less than $15 million despite serving a much larger geographic area. Airport improvement grants follow similar patterns that reinforce Western advantages over Eastern regions. The Federal Aviation Administration distributed $180 million in grants to Pacific Northwest airports during 2024, with Seattle-Tacoma International Airport receiving $67 million for terminal expansions and runway improvements. Eastern Oregon airports received a combined total of $8 million for basic maintenance and safety upgrades, amounts insufficient to support commercial aviation development. Zoning laws and development regulations across Eastern counties create additional barriers that make development more difficult and expensive compared to Western metropolitan areas. Environmental impact assessment requirements often cost $2 to $5 million for major development projects in Eastern regions, where endangered species protections and habitat preservation rules are more restrictive than in already developed Western areas. The Endangered Species Act affects over 40% of land area in Eastern Oregon, through critical habitat designations for species like sage grouse and steelhead trout, limiting development options that western counties do not face. Water rights regulations in eastern regions create complex legal barriers that discourage new development, while western areas benefit from established municipal water systems. Acquiring water rights for new communities in eastern Oregon requires navigating state bureaucracies and potentially lengthy legal challenges from existing rights holders. The Oregon Water Resources Department has not issued new water rights in several eastern basins since 2015, effectively preventing large-scale development regardless of demand or economic viability. Tax policies and economic incentives often provide greater benefits to urban businesses than rural enterprises, despite intentions to promote balanced regional development. The Oregon Business Energy Tax Credit Program provided $340 million in incentives during 2024, but 82% of benefits went to companies located in western metropolitan areas, where renewable energy projects can connect to existing electrical grids more easily. Eastern regions lack the transmission infrastructure needed to make renewable energy projects economically viable, preventing rural communities from accessing tax incentives designed to promote economic development. Federal research and development spending concentrates overwhelmingly in western metropolitan areas, where universities and research institutions cluster around existing population centers. The University of Washington received over $1.2 billion in federal research funding during 2024, while Eastern Washington University received less than $35 million despite serving a much larger geographic region. This research funding creates high-paying jobs and attracts educated workers to western metropolitan areas while providing minimal economic benefits to eastern regions. Healthcare policies inadvertently favor metropolitan areas through reimbursement formulas and program structures that make rural healthcare economically challenging. Medicare reimbursement rates for identical procedures are often 15% to 25% lower in rural areas compared to urban regions, making it difficult for eastern communities to attract and retain medical specialists. Rural residents often must travel hundreds of miles for specialized medical care, making eastern areas less attractive for families and older adults. Education funding formulas create similar disadvantages for eastern regions despite good intentions to provide equal educational opportunities. Federal Title I funding for low-income schools distributes money based on student enrollment, but eastern counties with declining populations receive proportionally less funding per student than western metropolitan districts with stable or growing enrollment. Infrastructure spending formulas systematically favor areas with existing population density, creating self-reinforcing cycles that concentrate development in western metropolitan areas. The American Rescue Plan Act distributed $2.8 billion to Pacific Northwest state and local governments during 2021, but allocation formulas based on population and unemployment rates directed most funding to western metropolitan counties. King County received over $400 million for infrastructure projects, while Grant County in eastern Oregon received less than $8 million despite having greater per capita infrastructure needs. Government procurement policies favor companies located near federal facilities, universities, and transportation hubs that concentrate in western metropolitan areas. Defense contracts, technology purchases, and professional services agreements systematically flow to western regions, where contractors can more easily meet federal requirements for security clearances, specialized facilities, and rapid response capabilities. The structure of modern governance inherently favors dense population centers through representation systems, funding formulas, and administrative convenience that channel resources toward western metropolitan areas regardless of policy intentions. Yet beyond these institutional forces, human decisions about where to live often depend on factors that have nothing to do with economics or government policy. Cultural and social forces that keep people west. Social and cultural factors play a surprisingly decisive role in determining where Pacific Northwest residents choose to live, often outweighing purely economic considerations in location decisions. These invisible forces operate below the surface of housing costs and job markets, creating powerful magnets that draw people toward western metropolitan areas while making eastern regions feel isolated and disconnected from modern American life. Educational opportunities concentrate dramatically in western metropolitan areas, creating foundational advantages that shape family location decisions for decades. The University of Washington enrolls over 47,000 students across its Seattle campus, while Washington State University serves another 31,000 students in Pullman near the Idaho border. Portland State University and Oregon State University combine to educate over 55,000 students annually, creating vast educational ecosystems that extend far beyond campus boundaries. These institutions attract faculty, researchers, and graduate students who establish families and careers in surrounding communities, while also drawing undergraduate students who often remain in the region after graduation. Eastern regions lack comparable educational infrastructure despite covering much larger geographic areas. Eastern Washington University serves fewer than 11,000 students, while Eastern Oregon University enrolls just 3,800 students across its La Grande campus. The University of Idaho in Moscow supports 11,500 students, but remains geographically isolated from major population centers. These enrollment disparities reflect both cause and effect relationships, where smaller populations cannot support major universities, while the absence of major universities prevents communities from attracting the educated populations needed for economic growth. Social networks and career opportunities create self-reinforcing migration patterns that concentrate educated professionals in western metropolitan areas, regardless of housing costs or living expenses. Young adults who attend universities in Seattle or Portland develop social connections, professional networks, and romantic relationships that anchor them to these regions long after graduation. Alumni networks from major Pacific Northwest universities cluster heavily in western cities, creating ongoing professional advantages for members who remain in the region. Job referrals, business partnerships, and career mentorship opportunities flow through these networks in ways that favor western metropolitan areas over eastern alternatives. Professional associations, industry conferences, and continuing education programs concentrate in western cities where sufficient populations exist to support regular events and meetings. The Portland chapter of the American Institute of Architects has over 1,200 members and hosts monthly programs, while Eastern Oregon lacks sufficient architects to support comparable professional organizations. Seattle supports dozens of technology meetups, professional development workshops, and industry networking events that eastern regions cannot match despite potentially lower costs for venue rental and event coordination. Cultural amenities like arts, entertainment, and dining options create quality of life advantages that consistently favor western cities over eastern alternatives. Seattle supports multiple professional theater companies, symphony orchestras, and art museums that require substantial populations to maintain viable audiences and donor bases. The Seattle Art Museum, Benaroya Hall, and numerous smaller cultural venues create an ecosystem of cultural activity that eastern regions cannot replicate regardless of government funding or community enthusiasm. Portland's food scene includes over 4,000 restaurants representing dozens of international cuisines, compared to Eastern Oregon communities, where dining options remain limited to basic American fare and chain restaurants. Healthcare access and quality differences between Western and Eastern regions influence family location decisions in fundamental ways that extend far beyond emergency medical care. Western metropolitan areas support medical schools, research hospitals, and specialist practices that provide comprehensive healthcare services within reasonable driving distances. The University of Washington School of Medicine trains physicians who often establish practices in surrounding communities, while Oregon Health and Science University serves similar functions for the Portland metropolitan area. Eastern regions struggle to attract and retain physicians due to smaller patient populations, lower reimbursement rates, and professional isolation from colleagues and continuing education opportunities. Specialized medical services concentrate overwhelmingly in Western metropolitan areas, forcing Eastern residents to travel hundreds of miles for routine procedures that Western residents access locally. Pediatric specialists, cancer treatment centers, and surgical subspecialties require patient volumes that only metropolitan areas can provide. Eastern Oregon families dealing with serious medical conditions often must relocate temporarily or permanently to Western cities to access appropriate care, creating additional burdens that influence long-term residential decisions. Dating and social opportunities significantly influence young adult location decisions in ways that demographic data captures, but policy makers often overlook. Single professionals in their 20s and 30s consistently report that social scenes and dating options factor heavily into residential choices, sometimes outweighing salary considerations or housing costs. Western metropolitan areas support diverse populations that create varied social opportunities, while Eastern communities often lack sufficient young adult populations to sustain active social scenes. Family networks and social connections anchor people in Western areas through relationships that prove difficult to replicate in new locations. Extended families often cluster in metropolitan areas where multiple generations can access shared resources like childcare, eldercare, and social support systems. Moving to Eastern regions means leaving these established support networks, requiring families to build new relationships in communities that may lack comparable social infrastructure. Survey data consistently shows that quality of life considerations favor Western metropolitan areas over Eastern alternatives across multiple demographic groups and age categories. Recent surveys indicate that access to healthcare, educational opportunities, and social connections rank higher than housing costs in residential location decisions among college-educated adults, the demographic group most likely to drive population growth and economic development. These cultural and social forces have proven remarkably persistent across decades of economic and technological change, suggesting that current settlement patterns may represent more than temporary preferences. What the future holds for the empty East. These cultural preferences point toward future settlement patterns that will likely intensify rather than balance out across the Pacific Northwest. Current trends and projections through 2030 and beyond show Western metropolitan areas poised for continued growth, while Eastern regions face mounting challenges that make population redistribution increasingly unlikely. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council projects electricity demand could double by 2046, driven primarily by data centers, electric vehicles, building electrification, and green hydrogen production. This massive infrastructure expansion will concentrate overwhelmingly in Western metropolitan areas where existing electrical grids, cooling water sources, and skilled workforces already exist. Data centers require enormous amounts of reliable electricity and cooling capacity that Eastern regions cannot provide economically, ensuring that the technological revolution driving regional growth will reinforce Western advantages rather than create new Eastern opportunities. The Council forecasts annual energy demand increases between 1.8% and 3.1% from 2027 to 2046, with peak demand potentially reaching between 47,000 and 60,000 megawatts by 2046. These projections assume continued population and economic growth concentrated in areas where electrical infrastructure can support expanding energy needs. Eastern regions lack the transmission capacity and generation resources needed to support large-scale data center development or major industrial expansion, making them unlikely beneficiaries of the technological growth driving regional economic development. Emerging technologies show little promise for changing these settlement patterns because modern innovations actually favor density and connectivity over geographic distribution. Artificial intelligence development, semiconductor manufacturing, and advanced computing require proximity to research universities, skilled labor pools, and high-speed data networks that concentrate in Western metropolitan areas. The Pacific Northwest's growing role in global technology markets will likely strengthen Seattle and Portland as innovation centers, while providing minimal economic benefits to eastern regions that lack the infrastructure and human capital needed for participation in advanced technology sectors. Climate change impacts will create additional barriers to eastern settlement while making western areas relatively more attractive despite their own climate challenges. Climate models indicate that eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and Idaho will experience temperature increases of 4 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050, along with decreased summer precipitation that will worsen drought conditions and wildfire risks. Eastern regions face becoming increasingly unsuitable for large populations as extreme heat events become more frequent and water resources become less reliable. The extreme heat wave during summer 2021 demonstrated the vulnerability of Pacific Northwest regions not yet adapted to dangerous triple-digit temperatures. Eastern areas experienced the most severe impacts because they lack the air conditioning infrastructure, emergency services, and healthcare capacity needed to protect residents during extreme weather events. Future climate projections suggest these heat waves will become routine rather than exceptional, making eastern regions increasingly dangerous and uncomfortable for human habitation. Agricultural projections show mixed impacts across different crops and regions, but overall trends suggest declining productivity in eastern areas while western valleys maintain better growing conditions. Temperature increases will affect livestock and crop production differently, with some crops like onions showing greater sensitivity to temperature changes than grains. Eastern Oregon's agricultural economy faces particular challenges as traditional wheat and cattle operations become less viable under changing climate conditions. Remote work adoption has stabilized at levels far below what would be needed to drive significant eastward migration, with hybrid work arrangements requiring proximity to Western metropolitan offices. Oregon population projections show continued growth reaching 4.4 million by 2030, but this growth will concentrate in Western metropolitan areas where jobs, services, and infrastructure can support expanding populations. Eastern counties continue experiencing population decline despite theoretical advantages of lower costs and more space. Changing demographics and generational preferences actually favor Western metropolitan areas because younger generations prioritize access to cultural amenities, educational opportunities, and social connections over housing costs or space. Millennials and Generation Z workers consistently choose locations based on lifestyle factors that eastern regions cannot provide regardless of economic incentives. These generational preferences appear permanent rather than temporary, suggesting that future population growth will continue concentrating in western areas even as housing becomes increasingly expensive. Resource scarcity and environmental pressures are more likely to accelerate western concentration than forced geographic redistribution because western metropolitan areas possess greater resources for adaptation and resilience. Water scarcity affects eastern regions more severely than western areas, while wildfire risks make eastern locations increasingly unsuitable for large populations. Environmental challenges will force some population redistribution, but climate refugees typically move to areas with better infrastructure and services rather than remote locations with lower population densities. Current concentration trends will almost certainly continue and potentially accelerate based on mathematical advantages that Western metropolitan areas maintain across multiple factors simultaneously. Population density creates economic efficiencies that make Western areas more attractive for business investment, while existing infrastructure makes expansion less expensive than Eastern development. These advantages compound over time as Western areas capture increasing shares of regional economic growth, while Eastern areas struggle to maintain existing population levels. The evidence suggests this population imbalance represents a permanent feature of Pacific Northwest geography rather than a temporary condition that policy interventions might correct. The fundamental barriers created by climate, geography, infrastructure requirements, and economic realities appear insurmountable despite decades of government programs aimed at promoting Eastern development. Geography and economics continue trumping policy intentions and technological possibilities in determining where Pacific Northwest residents choose to live, work, and build communities. These enduring patterns reveal fundamental truths about human settlement in the modern era. The 2025 census data confirms what decades of technological advancement and policy efforts could not change. Geographic and economic forces continue concentrating 73% of the Pacific Northwest's 15.2 million residents west of the Cascade Mountains, leaving vast eastern territories nearly empty. Human settlement patterns remain surprisingly predictable and resistant to change despite remote work capabilities, government incentives, and infrastructure investments. The ancient barriers created by mountains, water scarcity, and climate continue dictating where people build their lives. In an age of global connectivity and digital transformation, location still matters more than ever in determining where Americans choose to live.